This week, I picked up on a shocking story that I have not heard a lot of people talk about yet, but this is a huge deal. And I believe that we'll be hearing a lot more about this story as the Middle East conflict continues. White House National Security Advisor Admiral John Kirby had a blip of a soundbite about this issue at a White House news conference today.
Director of National Intelligence came out publicly and said that we do know that Iran has been funding and encouraging some of the protest activity here in the United States.
And earlier this week, the U.S. Ways and Means Committee met to talk about so-called charitable and nonprofit organizations, including those groups behind the anti-Israel protests we've been seeing that have financial ties to Iran and terrorist organizations. The testimony is shocking and fascinating. But hearings have a tendency to drag out, so even though I expect this video to run a little bit long, I pulled out the most important and compelling testimonies about how terrorist groups are funding much of the explosion in Jewish hate that we've seen after October 7th.
This hearing focuses on tracing the money flowing through and from foreign adversaries and tax-exempt organizations into other organizations and other groups with ties to terrorism and or responsible for much of the anti-Semitism activities that have engulfed much of our country. We know that bad actors, both foreign and domestic, use various tools to sow discord in American society. Their goal is to destabilize us and turn us against each other.
That's Oversight Chair David Schweikert. The hearing looked at how anti-Semitic groups have been funded and trained in a coordinated effort against American Jews. They specifically looked at how terror groups have infiltrated American nonprofits and are using the tax code to funnel money to promote hate or fund terrorism.
Examining the role that is well-funded student organizations with possible ties to terrorism, like Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP, play a driving, virulent anti-Semitism on our college campuses using tax-exempt dollars.
Schweikert says there's a vast network of nonprofit organizations across the country with ties to terrorism, including universities and organizations that use university facilities.
Considering the network of American-based tax-exempt organizations that are funding anti-Semitism on college campuses and possibly supporting terrorist organizations like Hamas abroad. For example, we have seen reports about groups like American Muslims for Palestine and the People's Forum, who provide funding, talking points, information, materials to student groups with an aim of installing chaos and anti-American sentiment.
The chairman made very clear that the committee is not looking to shut down protests, but there should be boundaries.
Debate, discourse, absolutely American. Funding hate, unacceptable.
One thing that caught my attention is how people are being misled. And as a journalist, this really speaks to me that in a democracy, citizens have a critical responsibility to vet our news sources if we want to keep our democracy, which is based on access to a free, legitimate, and truthful press.
About 3 weeks ago, there was a study provided that almost half the online publications in America now are fake. They don't really exist. It's foreign actors or very dodgy, hate-filled groups that have stolen their mastheads on papers that went out of business years ago. How do you have a self-governing society when much of what they know is completely fraudulent and full of trying to tear us at each other?
Speaking of tearing us at each other, Jason Smith, the chairman of the full committee, opened with a scathing critique of his Democratic colleagues.
I apologize to the witnesses that not one of the Democrats have showed up today. This has been 2 committee hearings in the last 11 days that not one Democrat decided to come to work. I think it's pretty unacceptable, especially on a topic that is so important. Members of the Ways and Means Committee can weigh in on subcommittee hearings. And to think not one Democrat feels like it's important enough to sit on that side to look about the 501c3 tax-exempt status and how money is flowing to terrorist organizations and to the Chinese is appalling and unacceptable.
Smith says that over the course of their investigation, it has become clear that anti-Semitic activity on college campuses has been coordinated and funded by people taking advantage of tax-exempt groups.
The violence and hatred directed at Jewish Americans and in support of terrorist organizations like Hamas are not some organic uprising. There are well-orchestrated efforts by anti-American and anti-Jewish organizations within the United States that provide financial and logistical support to those who harass and threaten Jewish students.
Then he talked about Students for Justice in Palestine, which has chapters on more than 200 college campuses.
SJP receives significant support from groups like American Muslims for Palestine, AMP, despite their alleged ties to terrorism. Openly works in coordination with its fiscal sponsor called AJP Educational Foundation, Inc., to provide funding, talking points, and other material support. This organizational structure is being investigated by Virginia's Attorney General, and just this week, a court ruled that a case against them could move forward.
I talked about this Virginia case in another video that I recorded last month. So if you want to hear about that case in a little more detail, I will put the link in the description and you can click on that after you listen to this video. But SJP isn't the only group that's accused of having financial ties to terror. Smith talks about the Tides Foundation. He describes it as a left-leaning tax-exempt group that's sponsoring several entities with ties to American anti-Semitism. He says a lot of the worst anti-Semitism is popping up at American educational institutions, and he says that's not a surprise if you just follow the money.
Since the mid-1980s, Middle East nations have donated over $6.5 billion, including $2.7 billion in gifts from the nation of Qatar from 2014 to 2019 alone to American universities.
He says a lot of this funding has gone unreported, which is against the rules, and the funding from Qatar has had a major impact, which, as you'll hear, has been quite significant.
The institutions that accepted funding from Middle East donors have experienced, on average, 300% more anti-Semitic incidents than those that did not.
He adds that the Chinese Communist Party also has ties to the U.S. tax-exempt sector, and he cites a 501c3 called the People's Forum,
which called on activists to recreate the protest of the summer of 2020 before rioters occupied a building at Columbia University.
Smith adds that he has made a request to the IRS to revoke the tax-exempt status of an organization called the People Media Group.
This organization funds a publication by the name of the Palestine Chronicle that employed a so-called journalist who was caught actually imprisoning Israeli hostages in Gaza.
And he's calling for further investigation into tax-exempt groups that support designated terrorist organizations. They then heard from the first of three witnesses. Lara Burns, head of terrorism research for the program on extremism at George Washington University, says terrorists have used tax-exempt organizations as cover for decades to fund their activities and further their propaganda campaigns.
The Holy Land Foundation and the Islamic Association for Palestine were two of the first U.S.-based tax-exempt organizations created and used by Hamas as early as 1988.
She says in 1993, Hamas leaders met in Philadelphia to plot out how they could support the terror organization while deceiving America about their agenda. In 2001, their Holy Land Foundation was shut down after being identified as a Hamas front organization, but that wasn't the end of their work.
The individuals that ran the U.S.-based Hamas infrastructure continued their work here, developed new and different banners with some fresh faces, while maintaining the goal of supporting Hamas.
And Burns says in the past year there have been several nonprofit groups also accused of having ties to Hamas.
In examining these organizations, key factors to consider are their leadership's ties to terrorist organizations and their spread of Hamas propaganda, their international donors and recipients, and their financial transparency.
She says one of the biggest financial vulnerabilities exists in the practice of receiving and distributing something known as gifts in kind.
A common exploitation involves multiple charities claiming receipt and distribution of the same gift in kind shipment, falsely inflating their bottom lines and facilitating tax fraud.
That's because foreign financing for gifts in kind can be hidden by passing through corporate or private entities. She gives one example of organizations accused of supporting Hamas that have reported revenue coming from gift-in-kind medical supplies, but information about the exact type of supplies and to whom they were given is not transparent.
One of these organizations is a Texas-based tax-exempt charity, United Hands Relief. In looking at its leadership, one of the directors stands out. Hatem Fariz is a twice-convicted felon, convicted in Florida of providing support to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorist organization, and in Illinois for a fraud conspiracy. Fariz appeared on UHR tax filings for the year 2018. The same year, UHR's revenue increased 50-fold, with over $6.3 million listed as medical supplies in the form of gifts in kind, with no verifiable details about the donors or recipients, nor how, when, or by whom they were transferred. In examining UHR's Form 990s between 2016 and 2021, UHR did not reveal the identities of its foreign recipients, making an accurate assessment of their activities difficult.
And she says in addition to financing global terrorism, some nonprofit organizations are accused of spreading anti-Semitism in America.
In 2021 and 2022, UHR provided grants to the AJP Education Foundation, the alter ego of American Muslims for Palestine. AMP and AJP are subjects of various litigation over allegations of their involvement with Hamas. In the wake of October 7th, a number of individuals in the U.S. have indicated support for Hamas and spread anti-Semitic rhetoric. Leaders of the AMP and its affiliate, the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, have expressed happiness over the attacks, claimed Israel has no right to defend itself, and have made fiery speeches amidst protests claiming they would take back the U.S. like they would take back Palestine.
Then Burns goes on to explain a little bit about CAIR's background. She says the Council on American Islamic Relations was created at that 1993 meeting of Holy Land Foundation and Islamic Association of Palestine Leaders in Philadelphia. She says people from these groups have called for the death of America and Israel and demonized Jews, which has garnered praise from Iran and Hamas.
When terrorist propaganda campaigns lead to the normalization of anti-Semitic rhetoric and support for terrorist organizations on U.S. soil, a threat to our national security exists. When it becomes acceptable to voice hate against an individual or group because of their ethnicity, race, religion, or gender, and to advocate for violence and death of those people because of the color of their skin, whether they are brown, black, or white, or because of their religion, whether they are Muslim, Jewish, Christian, or other, a threat exists not only to our national security, but to our system of democracy.
Next, Oren Siegel, Vice President for the Center on Extremism at the Anti-Defamation League, talked about the unprecedented spike in American and global anti-Semitism following Hamas's brutal and bloody attack on Israel after October 7th.
Throughout the entirety of 2023, ADL documented over 8,800 anti-Semitic incidents nationwide, more than the previous 3 years combined. That is an average of 24 incidents per day, and it has not stopped.
The important part about what he said, and this part is crucial, is what a lot of people suspected, is that these protests were not spontaneous.
Many of these incidents result from coordinated campaigns, both on and off campus, that often glorify, legitimize, and celebrate terrorist groups responsible for the violence in Israel. For example, Students in Justice for Palestine, or SJP, which has been a signature project of the Chicago-based American Muslims for Palestine for over a decade, celebrated the massacre of Israelis as a, quote, historic win for Palestinian resistance. They called for, quote, not just slogans and rallies, but armed confrontation. And they issued toolkits to dismantle Zionism on campus, many of those featuring paraglider imagery alluding to Hamas militants.
Again, Siegel points out that those anti-Jewish, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist protests are escalating.
They have progressed from tent encampments and barricades as seen as at Cal, State Polytech, and Columbia, to vandalism, to arson, all in retaliation for perceived university support for Israel. And off campus, these incidents occur in public spaces, at businesses, at the homes of citizens, and even elected officials alike, including members of this committee.
As most Jews understand the words Jewish and Zionist to be interchangeable, it is shocking that the New York-based group Within Our Lifetime has called on followers to, quote, bring down every Zionist imperial system in the U.S. Siegel cites a protest that Within Our Lifetime and Students for Justice in Palestine organized against the Nova exhibit. This is a traveling exhibit that brought real artifacts from the murderous attack on Israel at the Nova Festival, which was like a nature peace festival in the desert. They brought those artifacts to New York. I visited that exhibit, and you must see it. If you can't make it to the traveling exhibit, which I believe it's left New York already, you can check out my vlog. I vlogged about it, and I'm gonna also put that link in the description of this video. Again, watch the whole video before you go to a different one, but you definitely wanna check that out. It's an absolutely incredible exhibit that is crucial to see to understand the depth to which this attack was brutal and horrific. You really get a sense of the enormity of what happened when you go to this exhibit. So do check out that video. But if it wasn't enough that they were protesting this exhibit, which is also a memorial, they were doing so, he says, in a way that incites violence.
They use language like flood Manhattan for Gaza to promote their rallies, a reference to the Al-Aqsa flood, Hamas's term for the atrocities of October 7th.
And Siegel says terrorist imagery is now so regularly seen at these rallies that people are no longer shocked or upset about seeing this imagery on American streets.
Support for terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and even the Houthis are now commonplace at rallies throughout this country. And the use of red triangles, which echo the way that Hamas marks targets in its own propaganda, have become the norm.
He says these American protest groups post on social media. He cited the Resistance News Network on Telegram, and he says terrorist content is often posted there as well without consequence. Now, as a side note, terrorists love Telegram because it's uncensored, and that's the place where they posted themselves some of their own most gruesome, horrific, traumatizing video footage from October 7th.
Another key organizing group, Samidun, a designated terrorist organization in Israel, which has already been banned in Germany, has expressed explicit support for those who have been convicted of terrorism and acts related to terrorism. And at a recent rally in New York City, a protester carried a flag with a Samidun logo that said, "Long live October 7th.
Siegel says these groups are enabled by tax-exempt 501c3 monetary sponsors that operate without transparency and that have no oversight.
For example, the Westchester Peace Action Committee Foundation, or WestPAC, a New York-based nonprofit, sponsors groups like Within Our Lifetime and SJP. The Alliance for Global Justice, an Arizona-based nonprofit, sponsors more than 130 projects, including Samidun.
And he says as there's no oversight, he recommends that these groups should be forced to provide information about their projects, including where the funding comes from and where it's being spent.
Projects that denigrate and marginalize pro-Israel and Jewish communities, or that endorse violence or other unlawful activities, should not be able to reap the benefits of 501c3 status by the virtue of their relationship with fiscal sponsors.
Siegel says Congress and the IRS have a responsibility to review these groups' financial sponsors to show that they're in compliance with the law.
Ensure that overt anti-Semitic discrimination precludes 501c3 recognition, and ensure that the Department of Education has resources it needs to enforce Title VI to protect Jewish students on campus.
Siegel ended by saying that the government should revoke the tax-exempt status of any organization that provides material support to designated terrorist groups. The third and final witness at this hearing on anti-Semitism and terror funding was Dr. Charles Asher Small, Executive Director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. He started off right off the bat by tapping into what I'm hearing a lot of Jewish people talking about in private. Dr. Small said he's afraid that we're reaching a tipping point in America regarding anti-Semitism and anti-democratic ideologies.
Professor Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winner, always taught that anti-Semitism is not a parochial issue for the Jewish people or for the state of Israel. Once this form of hatred is unleashed, it knows no bounds, and it attacks human decency and democratic institutions.
Dr. Small also asked the government to look into foreign funding of American universities. He explained that in places like China and Iran, revolutionaries focus on influencing or taking over higher education. Now, this part of the hearing to me was probably the most fascinating, shocking, and terrifying. He says most universities are tax-exempt 501c3 organizations, and they're not being transparent with their foreign partnerships and funding. Okay, and then he got into some insane figures. I know that congressional hearings aren't the most exciting, but stay with me.
In 2019, we found $3 billion in undocumented money coming from the Muslim Brotherhood to American higher education. The government launched a federal investigation, and in a short period of time, they found $18 billion in undocumented money coming to American universities.
$18 billion in undocumented educational funding. You'd think that would call for further investigation, but he says that that investigation was called off. Now, Dr. Small's organization recently resumed investigation into foreign funding of American universities, and they have published 11 reports since October 7th. Now, pay attention right here because this is important.
One report on Texas A&M, we found over $1 billion coming from the Qatari regime to Texas A&M. In the agreement that Texas A&M has with the Qatari regime, with the Qatar Foundation, they ceded all of their intellectual property rights to the Qatar Foundation.
So Qatar paid $1 billion to Texas A&M in exchange for their research findings. 502 research projects were funded by this agreement. Surely this can't be a security threat to give the intellectual rights to your findings to a foreign government with terrorism ties, right? Right?
58 have potential dual-use military. 13 projects has potential nuclear research implications.
Dr. Small explicitly says that this is a strategic and domestic military threat to America. But it gets worse.
At Cornell University, we've uncovered $10 billion in funding between the Qatari regime and Cornell University in their campus in Qatar.
$10 billion!
They receive $8 billion there and $1.95 billion in the United States. So there's an urgent need for transparency.
You think?
I think it's very important to understand that the Qatari regime has a bay'ah. In Islam, a bay'ah is a spiritual oath with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Now, in Hebrew, a bay'ah is a problem. I would say we have a bay'ah here.
The Muslim Brotherhood is an amalgamation of European genocidal anti-Semitism. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is the core ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. These are the words and ideas and lies that led to the Holocaust. So it's an amalgamation of a very reactionary form of Islam with European anti-Semitism.
Yep, we definitely have a bay'ah.
Qatar is a country of less than 350,000 citizens, and they're giving more money to American higher education than any other country in the world. So why would a small country like Qatar be interested in targeting, influencing our higher education?
Good question. Why would an adversarial foreign government invest billions of dollars into American education? But perhaps a better question is, why would the U.S. government allow that kind of interference in our educational systems? Now, Dr. Small said that his organization, ISGAP, also conducted an investigation into Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP.
And SJP also comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood in terms of their ideology. SJP, after October the 7th massacre, said publicly in their toolkit that they're not just simply supporting the people of Gaza or Palestinian people. They said, we are Hamas. We are a terror-designated organization in this country.
And this right here is where we get into the crux of the issue. Dr. Small explains that the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood is to weaken Israel so that they can destroy it. And the way to do that is to sow doubt between Israel and their democratic ally in the West, which is, of course, the United States. He adds that they are using anti-Semitism as a way to fragment, weaken, and destroy the United States.
The big Satan and the little Satan.
Now, don't think for a second that this explosion of anti-Semitism that we're seeing will end with the Jews. Now, these terrorist groups have told us for decades exactly what they want to do, which is destroy Israel and destroy the West. And they have said since October 7th that they want to perpetuate additional October 7th attacks again and again and again. But it's not just Israel they're after. They have their eye on the West because conquering America is the big prize. But fundamentalist Islamists can't get to the West unless they conquer the Middle East first. And the only thing standing in their way, as Netanyahu said in his speech to Congress this week, is the only democratic nation in the Middle East, which is Israel. Then they had a Q&A session with the witnesses. I'm going to skim through some of that because a lot of the questions essentially repeated the same question, which is, what can the government do? And the answer was that the government has to enforce their laws, enforce transparency, and follow through with consequences, which is to revoke tax-exempt status for so-called charitable organizations with financial terror ties. Dr. Small also asked the government to investigate universities because several universities are also funding SJP on campus, and they're also receiving money from Qatar, to which Representative Randy Feenstra added,
"These are tax-exempt universities, tax-exempt, not paying a dime of taxes. And yet, look what they're doing. And not only are they tax exempt, but they're also obviously what you said, Dr. Small, and through your study, through global anti-Semitism policy, is that they're taking foreign dollars, lots of foreign dollars. You think about those that are taken, I think you noted that obviously there's a direct correlation between the school and those taking funds and activism that's happening on these college campuses. But it's noted Columbia University is taking dollars from Qatar. We know that's a hot spot for anti-Semitism. George Washington University is another school that has received a lot of money from Qatar. You mentioned Cornell.
But one question that I found particularly interesting was how ISGAP found the unreported money given to American universities by adversarial foreign governments.
Through our research, we were able to measure some level of discrepancy between the money that the universities are receiving and the monies that the universities are reporting to the government as required by law. And it's an indication of discrepancies. We know that we're just probably touching the tip of an iceberg. We estimate that Qatar has between $500 billion to $1 trillion that it's using for soft power, investing in the economy of the United States, from foreign entities into the United States, and also buying domestic companies, corporations, banks, which then act to use soft power legally from domestic corporations.
Chair Schweikert also chimed in that part of the concern then is how much of the money ends up in politics and is untraceable. Meanwhile, Orrin Siegel answered a question from Representative Greg Steube, in which Steube asked Siegel if he was surprised to learn of SJP's connection to American Muslims for Palestine and the activity in which they're engaged on American campuses. Siegel says that he's not surprised, and the reason why is illuminating.
Because SJP has been a signature project of AMP for many years. AMP used to bring them together at various conferences, literally fly in students to try to train them on their ideologies, their goals, provide them talking points. And so very much what we're seeing on college campus with the activities of SJP mirrors much of what AMP has been advocating for ideologically and their activities as well.
And Dr. Small drove the point home that the important connection between these groups, SJP and AMP, is their extremist ideology that can be traced back to the Muslim Brotherhood.
And the Muslim Brotherhood wants to replace democratic societies with a caliphate. They want to destroy the state of Israel and murder Jews. This is in their constitution. Hamas is the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's not a surprise, therefore, that SJP called for identifying with Hamas, not just with the Palestinian people or the people of Gaza, but specifically with Hamas, with a designated terror organization.
Dr. Small explained the alarming danger of the foreign funding and the role of academia in ushering in anti-democratic values that can change the nature of our lives.
The fact that universities are taking funds that support classroom activity, curriculum, research, and publications is, I think, of extreme importance. The fact that Jews are being maligned in the classroom as being portrayed as colonizers and apartheid supporters and white privileged people, it's important to understand that academia leading up to the Holocaust portrayed Jews as not white and poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. This was supported by academia back in the day of eugenics and theology. And in less than 2 generations, professors now, with this funding, are now saying that Jews are white. And it's not that we're white, welcome to the club, and we're sorry for what happened. Now the Jews are the embodiment of white privilege, white supremacy, apartheid, colonialism, and occupation. It goes from the classroom to the encampments, and from the encampments with SJP, Muslim Brotherhood ideology in the classroom, encampments, and now on our streets.
Oren Siegel got right to the point of proposing a solution.
Congress should clarify that engaging in anti-Semitism should preclude groups from receiving this 501c3 status. As simple as that. We have it with other types of discrimination, and anti-Semitism needs to be included as part of that.
And Lara Burns says stopping funding of terror groups hiding behind charitable organizations should be easy to do because these are laws that are already on the books. They just need to be enforced.
Committing criminal activity and even the promotion of civil disobedience are violations of their status, and empowering governmental agencies to actually revoke their status would be very beneficial.
And Siegel emphasized that so-called pro-Palestinian protests, some call them pro-Hamas protests, are openly supporting terror groups and are being enabled by tax-exempt organizations like Westpac.
At those events, not only PFLP, Hamas, and Hezbollah flags fly, but also signs that say Zionists are not human. Increasingly, we are seeing people targeted at their homes, whether it's civilians, whether it is elected officials, in part because within our lifetime says Zionists have no place in society in New York and elsewhere. And Westpac, what it does is enable that activity by providing funds, and yet there's no transparency in how much money is going to Within Our Lifetime or SJP. Westpac receives funding from various different foundations, then essentially enables its own 501c3 status to be part of Within Our Lifetime and SJP. And what they are doing is not benefiting the public. What they are doing in terms of engaging in anti-Semitism, harassment campaigns, etc., should not be protected by these codes.
Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, a former FBI special agent, also pointed out that the group Sammy Dune is sponsored financially by the Alliance for Global Justice, a 501c3 charitable organization.
Sammy Dune describes themselves as, quote, an international network of organizers and activists working to build solidarity with Palestinian prisoners in their struggle for freedom. In 2001, the Israeli Ministry of Defense designated the group to be a terrorist organization and a subsidiary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, which was a designated FTO, foreign terrorist organization, by our own U.S. State Department back in 1997. In September of 2023, a payment processing company stopped handling donations for Sammy Dune's fiscal sponsor after concerns were raised about their ties to PFLP.
And to this, again, panelists said that they need a whole government approach and that those who violate tax-exempt rules by spreading terrorist propaganda should have their statuses revoked. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the groups not only fund terrorist ideologies, they also promote anti-Semitism. Siegel talks about the dog whistle words that anti-Semites use.
For many anti-Semites, regardless of where they find themselves on the ideological spectrum, they use code words often to refer to Jews, and Zionist has been one that has been used for a long time. There are those who say that they don't oppose or hate Jews, they just hate Zionists. But what that does not account for is that 80% of American Jews, according to a Pew report in 2001, sort of recognize that Israel is a huge part of their identity. Many times the types of language and narratives and conspiracies that are used to target Zionists, those who believe that Israel should have its own self-determination in its own state, those mirror the types of anti-Semitic canards that we have seen over years as well. So anti-Zionists have a significant anti-Semitism problem. And oftentimes we see protests against the state of Israel, for example, in front of a synagogue. That tells you that they are ascribing blame for the actions of a state to entire religious community, which is classic anti-Semitism.
And Dr. Small drew further ties between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
My colleagues and I 10 years ago did a report. We interviewed 10,000 people in 10 European countries, and we showed the correlation between what we call Israel bashing or anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And those who are Israel bashers or anti-Zionist are 13 times more likely than the national average to be anti-Semitic in the classical sense. And this study actually helped to create, in the IRA definition, the link between Israel bashers, people that dehumanize Israel, and associate Jews around the world to state policies. So that connection is strong, and it's the cutting edge, I suspect, of the new hatred that exists there, the contemporary anti-Semitism.
Lara Burns explains that the terror offshoots here in America have been playing the long game. What we're seeing right now on college campuses is the result of decades of infiltration with vast roots now in this country.
And the purpose of this infrastructure was twofold: to fund terror abroad and to spread anti-Semitic and terrorist propaganda within the United States, to radicalize and groom the population. They planned to do this. They planned how they would do this in 1993 at the conspiratorial meeting in Philadelphia. They recognized at that time that their organizations would receive scrutiny, they would be shut down, and they planned at that time that they would merely reopen new organizations, which is exactly what we have seen happen.
But why would these groups go to such lengths? Who has such patience? What's the ultimate goal?
To spread their radicalization here in the United States and basically to, sow discord and destroy our democracy.
Now, I will add a little commentary here to say that an Islamist caliphate is not compatible with freedom and democracy, which is why Israel and America are such a target. Israel, of course, being the only democracy in the Middle East, and America being a beacon of democracy for the world. Meanwhile, Dr. Small had one more alarming finding about what is being done with all the Qatari money that they're finding is flowing into the United States.
And what's also equally troubling, we're talking about higher education, where young people hopefully have the capacity in some cases to think and to think critically. We're also discovering now that QFI, the Qatari Foundation International, is also beginning to fund K through 12 education in the United States.
And we are seeing numerous incidents of anti-Semitism in K through 12 schools across the country, including here in my region of the country, Philadelphia. In fact, on the same day that the Ways and Means Committee held this hearing looking into the connection between tax-exempt organizations and terrorism, the Anti-Defamation League filed a 49-page complaint citing anti-Semitism and civil rights violations against the school district of Philadelphia. This report cites incident after anti-Semitic incident from teachers and students against Jewish students in the district. I'm also dropping a link to that report in the description of this video. It's horrendous and it's heartbreaking. I'm not going to break it down in this video, but let me know if that's something that you're interested in me doing. In summary, there are two things that I'd like to leave with you. Number one, stay outraged about the fact that educational institutions are being influenced by foreign money. Know that those institutions that take foreign money are more likely to host these non-organic protests and are much more susceptible to anti-Semitism on their campuses. And number two, stay informed. Our democracy depends on it. You can't make good choices if you don't have good information. That's it. You made it to the end. Clearly you're interested in my videos, so please let YouTube know that this is good content and to send it out to other people, and you can do that by subscribing. Thanks, everybody. Bye.